I still remember the crystalline chime of the wine glasses that evening, a sound meant to evoke warmth and celebration. Instead, it cut through me like a shard of ice. My husband's family home in Cedar Grove was a sprawling Craftsman-style residence, its warm porch light beckoning guests as if promising safety. But it offered no sanctuary for me. My name is Helen Carter, a woman who built every corner of that house with her own 2 hands and heart. The mahogany front door, the knotty-pine trim, the slate hearth around the fireplace. They were all chosen by me, meticulously selected at long hours while balancing spreadsheets for my marketing job and tending to our young son, Lucas. My mother's inheritance had paid the down payment, but I'd logged nights of overtime just to cover the mortgage and renovations. When we moved in, Lucas was 3, and Sophia, my daughter-in-law, was still an aspiring artist living in a studio apartment 2 towns over. I welcomed her, took her under my wing, and gave her the spare room upstairs. But on this night, March 21st, 2025, a date etched into my memory, I realized that what I had given was never enough. Sophia had invited her parents over for a small dinner to introduce them to the home she and Lucas planned to share someday. I, with my usual eagerness, agreed to prepare a meal: herb-roasted chicken beneath a blanket of spring vegetables, artisanal bread from the bakery 2 blocks away, and a red wine from Napa that I had aged for exactly 2 years. Everything was lined up neatly on the island: the butcher block butcher's board, the copper pots gleaming on the stove, and the vase of freshly cut forsythia to echo the early blossoms outside. It was a scene I had rehearsed in my mind countless times. The doorbell rang just past 7. I opened it to Mrs. Alvarez's warm embrace and Mr. Alvarez's polite nod. Their oddly curious glance swept the entryway, the family photographs I had arranged on the walls, pictures of Lucas in his first soccer uniform, of our vacations in the Pacific Northwest, of me kneeling on a ladder painting the living room a soft dove gray. They paused at each frame, and without missing a beat, Mrs. Alvarez asked in her soft Spanish accent, "And who might this be?" I forced a polite smile. "I'm Helen, Lucas's mother. Welcome, come in." Her eyebrows lifted as she studied my hands, the ones calloused from years of renovations and repairs. "But you look too domestic," she said, her voice a whisper only meant for the dining room. Sophia laughed before I could collect my dignity. "Oh, that's just Mom. Helen's our unofficial housekeeper." She waved a carefree hand as if swatting away a curious fly. The laughter that followed had the warmth of candlelight, but it burned me from within. My own son joined in, a proud grin on his face as he echoed, "Yeah, Mom keeps things running. We'd be lost without her." They all laughed, Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Alvarez, and Lucas. They laughed, and I, standing in a dress that I'd selected from our first anniversary gift list, felt the floor open beneath me. The laughter was a chorus of betrayal. I held the wine bottle I'd fetched from the cellar, cold condensation slipping between my fingers. My chest constricted as if someone had punched me. I smiled, a tight, brittle curve that barely reached my eyes. "Would you like something to drink, Sophia?" I asked, my voice calm as a still pond moments before the ice breaks. "No, thank you, Helen," she said breezily, the family laughter fading into the hum of my humiliation. She sat, and I placed the bottle on the counter as I excused myself. I retreated to my bedroom at the end of the hall. The walls were painted a soft seashell white, a color I had picked for its clash with the deep mahogany bookshelves I installed myself. I closed the door behind me and let my back slide against it until I was sitting on the hardwood floor, legs drawn close to my chest. My heart pounded so loud I thought they must hear it. I should have known, I thought. I should have seen the signs earlier. the way they spoke over me, the way Lucas never bothered to introduce me properly at family gatherings, the way Sophia's laughter at my expense was so practiced and effortless. My mother raised me to endure such slights with grace. My grandmother, tougher still, taught me that silence can be a sharper weapon than words. And so I remained silent. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake beneath the linen sheets that felt suddenly foreign, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant echo of laughter. The aroma of rosemary and garlic still hovered in the kitchen. I thought of my mother's old bungalow, where I grew up, where I learned to sew curtains and bake bread. I thought of the assertion I once felt, that home was where love and labor intersected. At dawn, I set out the coffee maker with mechanical precision, the same ritual I had performed every morning for the past 10 years. I fed our golden retriever Winston and filled his water bowl. I noticed that Sophia's yoga mat still lay in the dining room corner, a silent reminder of her recent morning routine, one she practiced in my home as if reigning queen of a realm she never truly built. When Sophia finally glided down the stairs, draped in pastel workout clothes, her phone scrolling through social media, she blinked in surprise at my presence, not with warmth, but with obligation. "Good morning," I said, handing her a mug of coffee. The aroma of dark roast filled her nose, and for a heartbeat I saw recognition in her eyes. She took the cup without a word. I met her gaze, and in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I opened the top drawer of Lucas's old desk, a piece of mid-century modern walnut I had refinished myself. There lay the keychain, 6 brass keys, front door, back door, garage, basement hatch, mailbox, and the landscaper's gate at the side yard. I removed them and approached Sophia. "Here," I said, voice steady. "Good luck keeping up with the mortgage." She stared, coffee midway to her lips. "What?" I smiled, a peculiar, calm expression. "All of it belongs to me." The keys glinted in her hand like a gauntlet thrown. She gasped, and I turned away, walking past the gallery of framed photographs I had arranged on the hallway wall. Each frame held a memory of a life I thought I shared, each image a testament to a woman who had given until there was nothing left to give. I slipped on the trench coat I'd worn when I first toured the house with a young Lucas bouncing at my heels. I grabbed my leather satchel from the hook by the closet. Inside were nothing but my wallet, my phone, and the notebook where I'd sketched out business plans and renovation budgets. I did not look back as I left. Outside, the early morning air smelled of damp earth and budding lilacs. I walked to my car, parked by the curb, Winston's leash hanging on the doorknob to remind me he'd need a long walk later. I paused, hand on the driver's side door. I heard Lucas's voice behind me, breathless in his bare feet, stumbling out onto the porch. "Mom!" he called, but I did not turn. He chased me down the gravel drive, voice rising. But I kept walking. I closed the car door with care. No slam, because this departure was not born of rage. It was born of clarity. And clarity, unlike anger, is silent. As I drove away from the life I had built, from the son who'd laughed at my expense and the daughter-in-law who treated me as if I were furniture, I felt a strange sense of peace. The rearview mirror showed Lucas standing on the porch, stunned, his world collapsing in the reflection. I did not know where I was going. All I knew was where I was not staying, a new beginning in an old apartment. 2 days later, I found my refuge in a small studio apartment 2 miles from the city center. It was a relic of an older era, scuffed linoleum floors, yellowed lace curtains, and a radiator that rattled at random intervals. The rent was modest, a fraction of my former mortgage payment, and it came furnished with a sagging couch and a rickety bookshelf. I dropped my satchel on the chipped formica table and stood staring at the kitchenette with its pale green cabinets. I had no context yet, No storyline to impose on this empty space, apart from my own desire to vanish. I sat on the couch, fatigue delivering a heavy blow. I didn't cry, didn't laugh. I just sat, the weight of years of unseen labor pressing me against the backrest. Over the next few days, I moved like a ghost. I slept on the couch because the bed frame in the bedroom was broken. I survived on takeout sandwiches and instant soup. I did not call Lucas. I did not reach out to Sophia. I existed in a silence so thick it felt like a presence in the room. Then, while exploring the small closet beneath the stairs, I found a dusty old trunk. The owner's manual said it once belonged to the previous tenant's great-aunt. Inside, beneath moth-eaten shawls and tarnished heirloom jewelry, was a sealed manila envelope. Addressed to the occupant, in looping handwriting, was my name, Helen Carter. The return address was a name I recognized from my childhood, Aunt Madeline's house in Tacoma. The postmarked date read May 4th, 1995. My heart thudded as I carefully slid the envelope from the trunk. It was thick with the hint of aged paper and secrets. I sat cross-legged on the floor, hands trembling as I broke the seal. The first sheet was a letter in Aunt Madeline's unmistakable script. Dearest Helen, if you are reading this, it means you have come home. If only to yourself. The truth about that night in 1985 has weighed on me for decades, and I cannot carry it any longer. Inside this package, you will find copies of documents that explain everything. Please forgive me for not telling you sooner. I was afraid, and I hoped time would make it unnecessary. But time does not mend what is buried. Beneath the letter lay photocopies of hospital birth records, 2 birth certificates with swapped names, and a single grainy photograph of an infant wearing a hospital blanket. The name on the original certificate was different from mine. Margaret West. My hands went cold. I stared at the photograph. That infant, comforted by a nurse's gentle fingers, was not just a random baby. She was my sister. My life had begun in a hospital room where, on a stormy night, 2 infants were switched by mistake. One went home to the West family. The other went home to the Carters. I sat on the floor with that envelope and the copy of Aunt Madeline's hospital notes for hours. There was no immediate grief, no panic, only a slow, steady unfolding of awareness, like dawn creeping across a dark sky. Aunt Madeline had been the charge nurse in the maternity ward. She'd discovered the error too late, after both infants had been discharged. She'd tried to raise it, but the hospital quietly settled with the other family. She'd kept the secret, hoping it would fade. But it never did. She packed the documents away, intending one day to tell me. But life's fragility overtook her, and she passed away before she could speak, and now the burden passed to me. I placed the documents back in the envelope with reverent care and slipped them into my satchel. I would have to make sense of them, but not tonight. Tonight, I would drink a cup of tea on the sagging couch and let the rattle of the radiator be the soundtrack to my awakening. Tomorrow, I would begin to read every page, every note, every line. Tomorrow, I would live with the knowledge that my entire life had been built on someone else's mistake. And tomorrow, perhaps, I would find out who I truly was. I woke before dawn the next morning, the envelope from the trunk clutched in my hand like an artifact waiting to be deciphered. The studio apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the radiator. I brewed a strong mug of coffee and settled onto my sagging couch, the envelope resting on my lap. The air smelled faintly of jasmine tea from the candle I'd lit the night before, a small luxury in this austere new existence. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal again and pulled out the letter from Aunt Madeline. Her cursive handwriting was unmistakable, careful loops and flourishes that I recognized from family letters throughout my childhood. I read her words again, slower this time, letting each phrase sink in. The truth about that night in 1985 has weighed on me for decades, and I cannot carry it any longer. I placed the letter aside and turned to the stack of photocopies. The first was a birth certificate, my birth certificate, but with someone else's name. The second was the certificate that bore the name Helen Carter, but with a different baby's birth weight and time. They were laid out with clinical precision. I flipped through the hospital notes next. Annotations in Aunt Madeline's handwriting, scribbled in the margins of typed pages. She'd noted the last-minute swap of cribs in the nursery, a misread tag on one bassinet, and her own rising panic when she realized 2 infants were sent home with the wrong families. Her final entry was a plea for mercy. I buried this beneath the others, hoping no one would ever uncover it. Forgive me, Helen. I was terrified. The final sheet was the photograph of an infant swaddled in a pale blue blanket, his tiny face turned toward the camera. A nurse's gloved hand rested protectively on his chest. Across the bottom, a hospital stamp read, Sickles General Hospital, Night Shift, April 12, 1985. I stared at that photograph, and something inside me shifted. The apartment walls seemed to grow narrower, the radiators rattling louder. I set the documents aside and stood, pacing the length of the living room. The linoleum floor creaked under my steps. Who was in that photograph? If the baby in blue was not me, then who was I? And what of Margaret West? The name scrawled on the first certificate? Aunt Madeline's letter mentioned 2 infants switched at birth. One raised as Helen Carter, the other as Margaret West. My heart hammered as I realized that all my memories, joys, and sorrows had belonged to someone else's destiny. I sank onto the couch, head in my hands. The quiet resolution I'd felt that morning dissolved into dread and longing. All my life, I had been the architect of safety, fixing leaky faucets, repairing creaking floorboards, ensuring that every corner of my home radiated comfort. But here, in this impersonal apartment, the foundations of my own identity had crumbled. I spent the next hour cross-referencing dates and details. According to the settlement papers Aunt Madeline included, the hospital quietly compensated the other family, the Wests, with a small sum and transfer of medical records. I pulled out my phone and searched for any mention of West family records in public archives. There was nothing. It was all sealed. Anger flared inside me, not at Aunt Madeline, who had tried to carry the secret alone, but at the hospital, at the fates that had taken 2 lives and exchanged them like paperwork. Cold clarity replaced my panic. I needed to learn more. I needed to find the West family papers Aunt Madeline referenced and, if possible, the person whose face I had stared at in that photograph. First, I would need a stable base. So I did something I rarely allowed myself. I applied for a small desk at the local co-working space down the street. It gave me a real chair and a proper desk lamp, luxuries I hadn't realized I missed. On day 2, I carried the envelope into the shared office, set my coffee on the desk, and began drafting an email to the hospital's records department. The subject line was simple: Request for release of records, Carter West Incident, April 12, 1985. My hands shook as I typed. I quoted the hospital's internal reference number from Aunt Madeline's notes. I attached scanned copies of the birth certificates and the initial letter, redacted only to protect personal addresses. I demanded transparency. I ended with a firm but respectful tone. I understand the sensitivity of this request, but I am prepared to pursue legal action if required. I appreciate your timely response. I sent the email and leaned back. My pulse raced, but part of me revered the act of standing up, of demanding the truth. For the first time in months, I felt agency. The response came 2 days later, short, official, and non-committal. The hospital had no record of any settlement and could find no files under the West name. It suggested I contact the medical records attorney. Frustration welled up. It was a dead end, but I had expected as much. Next, I turned my attention to public records. Margaret West's name had to exist somewhere. School yearbooks, local newspaper birth announcements, perhaps even a small-town genealogy site. I spent entire evenings at the public library rifling through microfilm of the 1980s local paper. I found an announcement. April 13th, 1985. Birth of twins to Jonathan and Diane West, April 12th, at Sickles General. The notice included the babies' weights. One was 7 pounds 2 ounces, the other 6 pounds 13 ounces. My birth weight matched the lighter one, but Aunt Madeline's notes indicated a different weight assignment. My pulse raced as I realized I held more confirmations. Yet these records didn't yield a name or a face. The Wests seemed to have moved away shortly after the births. No graduation announcements, no wedding notices. It was as if the family's public trail ended abruptly. That only deepened my curiosity. Beyond my investigation, I observed the life I'd left behind, Lucas and Sophia, through subtle channels. I created an alias email account and subscribed to local parenting forums. I saw Sophia posting sponsored content about home organization tips, featuring a house that was undeniably mine. Even worse, Lucas's social media feed was a stream of curated perfection, celebrating Martha's estate and tagging me as the caretaker. My anger flared, sophisticated rage tempered by strategy. They thought I'd vanished. They thought the house was theirs. They thought I'd become irrelevant, and perhaps I was, at least to them. But I was gathering power in silence. Late one night, I drafted a plan, tracked down a genealogist who specialized in switched-at-birth cases. I found one through an online referral and scheduled a Zoom call. I poured out the story, sending the genealogist the photocopies. She agreed to run DNA databases and cross-reference matches for a fee. The first report came a week later. No direct matches yet, but a cluster of distant relatives in Tacoma, Washington. That was where Aunt Madeline's family had roots. Every lead felt like another ember in a dying fire. Small, glowing sparks of hope. I kept working my day in the co-working space and returned to the library at night. The more I learned, the more layers peeled away. I discovered that the West family had donated a set of heirloom letters to a historical society before moving west. I filed a request to view their collection. Meanwhile, my consciousness grew sharper. The hum of that overhead office light replaced the silence of my apartment. I began documenting every step in a new notebook labeled Project Identity. I wrote down names, dates, record numbers, and the names of archivists I'd speak with. Through it all, I felt a transformation I had not anticipated. The woman who left behind a life of invisible labor was morphing into someone with purpose, with a mission. The anger and betrayal fueled me, but deeper than that was a sense of reclamation, a chance to reconstruct the narrative of my own life, unbound by the walls of that Craftsman house. 10 days later, I found myself navigating the damp streets of Tacoma, Washington. The Pacific Northwest air was crisp and smelled of cedar and salt from the nearby Puget Sound. I rented a compact sedan, silver, unremarkable, and packed my satchel with copies of Aunt Madeline's documents, my laptop, and a light coat. The drive from SeaTac Airport to Tacoma's Old Town District passed through neighborhoods of craftsman bungalows and historic brick buildings. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years, anticipation mixed with fear. My first stop was the Tacoma Historical Society, a red brick building with arched windows and a single oak door bearing a tarnished brass plaque. Inside, the large reading room smelled of aged paper and dust. An archivist, Ms. Ellison, greeted me with a polite tilt of her head. "Miss Carter?" she asked, consulting a small notebook. She led me to a back office lined with shelves of bound manuscripts. "I'm here about the West family papers?" I said. My voice sounded foreign in the solemn room. She nodded. "We have a collection donated in 1990. Jonathan and Diane West entrusted us with certain family scrapbooks and letters." I watched as Ms. Ellison retrieved a battered wooden crate and set it gently on the oak table between us. Inside were tattered leather-bound journals, yellowed envelopes, and sepia photographs, some of which bore my own face, though I didn't recognize the background. The first journal was dated 1988, the year the West family moved to California. The entries were in elegant cursive, Jonathan's handwriting, detailing their life in Tacoma. Job promotions, neighborhood potlucks, and an undercurrent of sorrow at losing one of their twin girls shortly after birth. I sifted through the pages until I found the entry on April 12, 1985. "Today we brought home our daughters, twins, beautiful girls." The nurse mixed up their tags, but she assured me it was nothing to worry about. She apologized, said they'd been swapped before I even knew. I felt a tremor in my heart when she mentioned it. But then the doctor said it was all in good order. "We're so excited." My breath caught. I traced the words with my finger. That tremor in Jonathan's heart matched the guilt Aunt Madeline had carried. I scanned the other pages. There were letters from Aunt Madeline, too, unsent drafts in which she begged forgiveness. One letter read, "I fear you never suspected the truth, but it's torn me apart. I hope these words reach you someday." Tears pricked my eyes. I'd come here seeking a map of my lost identity. Instead, I held real evidence of the West's own anguish. Ms. Ellison watched me kindly. "Would you like copies?" she asked. I nodded. "Please." While the society prepared the photocopies, I wandered the reading room. I found a map of the 1980s Tacoma Hospital District. Sickles General was no longer standing. The block had been cleared for new development. The memory of where two newborns had been swapped was gone, replaced by the anonymous glass tower of a tech company. It felt like the city had tried to bury the truth, too. That night, in a small inn overlooking Commencement Bay, I studied the copies. The West journals, Aunt Madeline's letters, and hospital forms formed a mosaic of betrayal and benevolence. I realized that Jonathan and Diane West must have sensed the truth, yet accepted their daughters regardless. One girl, myself, grew up in Tacoma for 2 years before being returned by a private settlement. But who was the other child? The one raised as Margaret West? And where had she gone? Determined to find her, I reached out to the genealogist and requested the full family tree for Jonathan and Diane. I also searched online for any public records of a Margaret West, born April 12, 1985. My search turned up a LinkedIn profile for a Margaret West, senior research analyst at a biotech firm in Seattle. The profile picture was a professional headshot, a woman with short auburn hair and a confident smile. Could it be her? I decided to drive to Seattle the next morning. The ferry ride across Puget Sound offered time to collect my thoughts. Clouds blanketed the sky, turning the water gunmetal gray. I imagined my life's trajectory diverging here. If that switch never happened, I would be on the biotech career path, perhaps riding this ferry for a weekend conference, not poring over birth certificates in a borrowed inn. Upon arrival in Seattle, I found a modest office park in Bellevue that matched the address on LinkedIn. I circled the block in my rental, heart thudding. I parked inconspicuously around the corner and watched the building's entrance. Office workers in crisp business attire arrived, coffee cups in hand. A woman with auburn hair stepped out, phone pressed to her ear. She was Margot. Margot West, I realized, since the company branding spelled her name that way. The resemblance to the infant in the photograph was unmistakable. I snapped photos from my phone, careful not to be seen. Then I drove south to an Airbnb 2 blocks away, booking a room for 3 nights under an alias. That evening, I drafted a message asking for an informational interview, presenting myself as a family history researcher interested in the West family legacy. I was transparent about my intent to view family archives. I pressed send and braced for silence or refusal. Miraculously, I received a curt reply the next afternoon. I'm away on a business trip until next week. I'll have my assistant send you details on archived materials at our downtown office. Thanks for reaching out. Margot W. It wasn't an invitation to coffee with her, but it was enough. I had access. The following day, I navigated the archived materials in a cramped meeting room. Margot's assistant, a young man named Adrian, watched me as I leafed through family scrapbooks. I spotted a tiny photograph of 2 baby girls in hospital cribs, my face as an infant on the left and another infant swaddled in pink on the right. The caption read, April 12, 1985, West twins at Sickles General. I felt a sob catch in my throat. The twin separation had been orchestrated by hospital staff and then quietly archived by the Wests in these scrapbooks. Adrian offered to make copies of any pages I needed. I scanned the family letters where Diane West wrote of her heartbreak at suspecting the switch, then letting fate decide which daughter she would fight for, and naming Margaret as the one whose calm strength reminded her of her own mother. I closed the album and looked up at Adrian. Thank you, I said quietly. I think that's all I need for now. Back in my Airbnb, I spread the copies across the bed. I had Aunt Madeline's notes, the Historical Society journals, and the West family scrapbooks, 3 threads weaving my story together across time and miles. As part 3 drew to a close, I realized the truth was more complicated than paperwork. The 2 families, mine and the Wests, had lived parallel lives, both entwined by love and sorrow. And at the center of this intersection lay me. I closed the scrapbook and sat in the dim light of the desk lamp. A single thought pulsed. To fully reclaim who I was, I needed to connect with Margot, to meet the sister I had never known, to bridge the gap forged by that midnight mistake. Part 4. The Quiet Confrontation. I spent the next few days laying low in my Bellevue Airbnb, nursing a mix of anticipation and dread. The documents I'd gathered felt like tinder, ready to ignite something irreversible. I rehearsed how I would introduce myself to Margot West, the sister I'd never known, now the woman I was desperate to meet. Late in the evening, I checked my email and found a subject line from Margot's assistant. Family history request. My heart caught in my throat. Ms. Carter, Ms. West has agreed to meet you in person. She will be at the downtown public library on Friday, April 11th at 4 p.m. Please come to the 3rd floor reading room. We ask that you keep the meeting confidential. Sincerely, Adrian Holt. Friday was 2 days away. I booked a conference room at the library under my given name, Helen Carter, and reserved seats in advance. I wore a simple navy blouse and jeans, neither too formal nor too casual. My hair was pulled back, and I applied minimal makeup. I wanted to look like myself, not like some shadow of the past. When Friday arrived, I drove in silence to downtown Seattle. The library stood tall, its granite pillars and spacious entrance a symbol of shared knowledge and history. I checked in at the information desk under my name and was directed to the 3rd floor. At precisely 3:50 p.m., I entered the reading room. It was a long, rectangular space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Rows of oak tables, dusty book spines, and the faint scent of polished wood greeted me. Margot was already there. She sat alone at a table near the window, a stack of books beside her. A copy of Pride and Prejudice, a volume on local history, and an old family biography printed by the Wests. She wore a charcoal blazer and black trousers, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Her posture was poised, her gaze fixed on the open book before her. I swallowed hard and approached. "Margot?" She looked up, surprised, then stood. Her eyes widened. She carried herself like a professional researcher, yet in that moment there was vulnerability in her expression. Hello," she said, voice soft but controlled. "You're Helen Carter?" I nodded. "Yes." She gestured to the seat opposite her. "Please, sit." The silence that followed was profound. Two strangers linked by an impossible secret. I sat, placed the envelope of documents on the table between us, and studied her face. The high cheekbones, the same delicate curve of the lips I had glimpsed in hospital photographs. She clasped her hands to still a tremor I sensed in her. "I'm so sorry," I began, voice thick. "This must be overwhelming." Margot blinked and let out a breath. "You're the one who requested this meeting," she said gently. "I know," I said. "But the truth is heavy, and I didn't want to just send emails. I wanted you to see me." She leaned back, eyes drifting to the stack of West family scrapbooks along the table's edge. "It's one thing to read documents. It's another to have the person in front of you." I nodded. "I've spent weeks piecing together your family's story and Aunt Madeline's notes. I wanted to be transparent." Margot's fingers brushed the top scrapbook. "My parents' legacy," she said in a whisper. "They never spoke of that night. I always sensed there was a wound beneath their smiles." I slid the birth certificates across the table. She examined them, her birth certificate and mine, pausing at the mismatched names and hand-scrawled hospital annotations. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "It says Margaret West on mine, but the handwritten note says Carter." "Yes," I said softly. "Our lives were switched at birth." Her hand flew to her mouth. She looked away, shoulders shaking. I hesitated, then reached out and placed my hand gently over hers. "I'm here because I want to meet you," I said, voice fragile. "Not because I want to replace anyone. I just need to know the sister I never had." Margot's tears slipped down her cheeks. I don't know what to say." "Say whatever comes," I urged. "I understand this is a lot." She stood, moving to the window as if seeking distance. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the skyline, painting the water in hues of orange and purple. Margot watched it, then turned. "When I first saw your messages, I thought it was a prank," she admitted. "But then I saw the documents." She trailed off, looking at the birth certificates again. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I followed the family tree and public records," I explained. "I'm sorry if that felt intrusive." She sighed, folding her arms. "No, I'm relieved someone else knew the truth. I always thought I was different for a reason I couldn't name." "I felt the same," I said. "Like I never quite fit, except I couldn't place why." She looked at me, curiosity mingling with sadness. "What was your childhood like?" I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. Painting the Craftsman's porch with Lucas, Sunday brunch in the sunlit dining room, the sting of Sophia's insults. It was devoted. I worked nonstop. I loved them fiercely, but I was never seen as Helen Carter, only as a caretaker. Margot's lips quivered. "My childhood was different. My parents adored me in their way. They took me to symphonies, book clubs, charity events. But there was a distance, like they were mourning someone else. And I was the someone else." I said softly. She stepped closer. What do you want from me? I stood as well, closing the space between us. To know you, to have a sister. Her chest heaved, tears shining in her eyes. Then slowly she extended her hand. I'd like that. We shook hands, hers warm, mine cold from nerves. Then she pulled me into a hug, brief but sincere. I felt her head rest on my shoulder, and I held her, marveling at how it felt like coming home. We sat back down and spent the next hour talking about our favorite books, dreams we once had, and the strange synchronicity of our lives. We discovered shared quirks, a love of Earl Grey tea, an obsession with old wooden furniture, the habit of reading by a single lamp at night. When the library lights dimmed for closing, we gathered our things. I packed the documents back into my satchel. Margot looked at me. Can we do this again? She asked. I smiled, relief flooding me. Absolutely, anytime. We exchanged numbers, a simple text that felt like a lifeline. Outside, the city had transformed into a constellation of lights. We walked down the marble steps side by side, two sisters bound by fate. That night, back in my Airbnb, I felt more complete than I had in months. I drafted a message to Adrian thanking him for arranging the meeting, and I sent a text to Margot. Helen, thank you for today. It was the beginning I didn't know I needed. Her reply came seconds later. Margot, me too. As part 4 closed, I realized I was not just reclaiming my life. I was building a bridge to another. The sister I never knew was standing right beside me, and together we would write the next chapter of our lives. Part 5. Fragments of Home. Between the elation of meeting Margot and the uncertainty of our intertwined futures, I found myself teetering on a precipice of hope and fear. I lingered in Seattle for 2 more days, moving slowly as if every footstep was a risk. I spent my mornings at a riverside cafe, nursing a chai latte, while my thoughts drifted toward Tacoma and the Craftsman house I once called home. The afternoons I dedicated to work, compiling a timeline, cross-referencing details, and the evenings I spent with Margot. We explored the city's hidden corners. On Saturday, we walked through the Olympic Sculpture Park, where metal beams and stone formations jutted above the Puget Sound. Margot told me about her time at the University of Washington and the thesis she'd written on post-Wawoo architecture. I shared memories of the Craftsman porch and the carefully restored sunroom where I taught Lucas his first words. Our laughter echoed against the steel sculptures, and for a moment, the weight of our birthright exchange dissolved into the breeze. But even in joy, shadows lingered. I sensed Margot's hesitation whenever we spoke of the future. One afternoon, we found ourselves sitting on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. She turned to me, her gaze fixed on the water. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked. I studied her face. About what? About the life you lost. About growing up knowing I wasn't alone while you had to discover all of this later. A pang struck my chest. I do. But I also know that fate doesn't work in neat lines. I wouldn't erase my experiences, and I wouldn't ask you to erase yours. She stared at the horizon. But I feel like I owe you something. You don't, I said firmly. I'm here because I want a sister, not to reclaim a stolen childhood. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. We sat in silence, the gulls calling overhead. Later that day, Margot invited me to her apartment in Capitol Hill. Her place was a curated reflection of her aesthetic. Mid-century modern furniture, art prints from local galleries, and a shelf lined with first editions. She poured tea for us, and we sat at her small dining table, passing the kettle back and forth. I want to share something, she said, retrieving a thin manila folder from a shelf. Inside were letters, handwritten pages from our parents to each other over decades. I took one in my hands. My dearest Diane. Sometimes I look at Margot and see Helen's eyes, so like my mother's, and it breaks my heart all over again. My fingers traced the faded ink. Every letter was a confession of love, guilt, and tears. My parents, unaware of the switch, had grieved silently, never understanding why they felt incomplete. Margot's voice cracked. I found these in a box of my mother's things after she passed last year. She never told me about Helen, but she wrote these words as if hoping to explain her heartbreak. Tears filled my eyes. I reached across the table and took Margot's hand. They loved you as Margaret, but you were meant to be Helen, and I was meant to be Margaret. But here we are. We spent the evening reading letters aloud, the words binding our fractured story with golden thread. As the city lights flickered outside her window, we realized that the parents we knew had lived with a silent wound, a wound we were destined to heal together. The next morning, I awoke to an email from the co-working space. My reservation for another week had been approved. I smiled at fate's timing. I would need stability to plan the next steps, legally reclaiming my identity, transferring property rights of the Craftsman house, and deciding how to move forward with Lucas and Sophia. I called the genealogist, who reported a small breakthrough: DNA matches with distant Carter descendants in Portland, Oregon. They were second cousins once removed, willing to share family stories and photographs. I scheduled a road trip for 2 weeks later, but the biggest challenge lay closer to home: Seattle. I had to decide what Helen Carter would become. Would I remain a shadow in Lucas's life? Or would I sever ties completely? And what role would Margot play in this new chapter? I met Margot for coffee at a bookstore cafe. We sat at a corner table with stacks of family histories between us. I laid out my plan: to initiate legal proceedings with the hospital for a formal acknowledgement of the birth switch, to explore the possibility of restoring my birth name, and to address the property deed originally in my name. I expected resistance: Sophia's lawyer's letters, Lucas's emotional pleas, but I needed to move forward. Margot listened attentively, her face solemn. "I want to help," she said. "Whatever you need." I nodded, grateful. "I can't do this without you." We spent the next hour drafting a joint statement, a letter to the hospital board summarizing evidence, supplemented by affidavits from Aunt Madeline's notes and the West family's own records. Margot agreed to accompany me to a meeting at Sickles General's corporate offices, scheduled for May 5th. Leaving the cafe, we paused on the sidewalk. An elderly woman passed us with a bouquet of daisies. She paused to smile at Margot. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, then smiled at me, eyes soft. "And yours, dear." Margot and I looked at each other, stunned by the stranger's words. The woman shuffled on, leaving us with unspoken affirmation that despite the chaos, we embodied the legacies of two families. That night, back at my Bellevue rental, I drafted the formal meeting request and printed the joint statement. I filled out the legal forms to petition for a name change and property transfer. Everything felt poised on the edge of transformation. As Part 5 closed, I realized that fragments of my former home, the Craftsman porch, the kitchen island, the family photographs, were no longer just memories. They were stakes in a battle to rebuild a life defined on my own terms. With Margot at my side and a growing network of cousins and supporters, I felt the slow stirring of a new home. Not just a house, but a sense of self that no one could ever take away again. Part 6: New Foundations. The morning of May 5th dawned bright and cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Margot and I met outside the chrome and glass facade of Sickles General's corporate headquarters in downtown Seattle. She wore a simple gray dress with a pale blue scarf. the same shade as the infant blanket in the hospital photograph. I carried a leather portfolio with copies of every piece of evidence we had amassed: birth certificates, Aunt Madeline's notes, the West journals, and our joint statement. We checked in at security and were escorted to a sleek conference room on the 14th floor. The city spread beneath us like a living map. Ferries crossing the Sound, traffic flowing on Interstate 5, Mount Rainier's snow-capped peak in the distance. I gripped the portfolio's edge, my knuckles pale. At 9:00 a.m., a door opened and two men entered, one in a crisp suit, the other in a white lab coat. They introduced themselves: Mr. Clark, the hospital's chief compliance officer, and Dr. Kim, the head of obstetrics. Their expressions were polite but guarded. I took a steadying breath. "Thank you for meeting with us," I said, voice calm. "My name is Helen Carter, and this is my sister, Margot West. We're here because of a birth incident on April 12, 1985, at this hospital." Mr. Clark nodded. "Ms. Carter, Ms. West, we received your email. Shall we proceed?" Margot slid our joint statement across the table and opened with controlled poise. On that date, 2 infants were switched and sent to their respective families under erroneous identification. The hospital arranged a private settlement, but never officially acknowledged the incident. We are requesting a formal acknowledgement, an apology, and help in correcting our legal records, Dr. Kim's brow furrowed as he reviewed the documents. "We have limited archives from that era," he said. "Many records were stored off-site and later lost in the campus redevelopment. However, we take these matters seriously." Mr. Clark interjected, "We will launch an internal review immediately. If the documentation supports your claim, we will issue a formal statement of regret and work with you to update your legal birth records." I exchanged a relieved glance with Margot. "We appreciate that," I said. "Additionally, I am requesting reimbursement for my mortgage payments and a restoration of my property deed, which was originally under my name before the house was transferred." There was a moment of silence. Dr. Kim adjusted his glasses. "Hospital policy typically does not involve property matters, but we can provide a letter clarifying your birth and the switch, which you can present to legal counsel." Margot leaned forward. "We expect institutional accountability. A letter of clarification alone will not suffice. We need legal endorsement to move forward with the deed correction." Mr. Clark nodded thoughtfully. "Understood. We will consult with our legal department today. Expect an interim response by the end of the week." We thanked them and left the building, the late morning sun warm on our faces. Outside, I exhaled a long, pent-up breath. "That went better than expected," I said. Margot smiled tentatively. "Still, it's only the beginning." Back in Bellevue that evening, I drafted a press release template in my notebook, a statement of the hospital's apology, a plan to update legal records, and an announcement of a small fund for families affected by such errors. I circulated it to Margot. She tweaked the language, ensuring it honored both families' experiences. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Emails from hospital lawyers, meetings with my own attorney to arrange the deed transfer, and phone calls with distant Carter cousins in Portland who shared childhood photographs. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sophia's lawyer sent a terse letter demanding I relinquish any interest in the house, claiming statute of limitations and contract waivers. Lucas called me, voice thick with emotion. "Lucas, Mom, please don't do this. I'm sorry. I thought we were a family." I hesitated before replying. "Helen, I am still your mother, Lucas. But I cannot stay a ghost in my own life. We need to redefine what family means." He was silent on the line. Then weeks later, I received a call from him. "Lucas, I read the hospital statement. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. Can we talk? I told him I was free any time. On June 10th, the hospital issued a public apology, acknowledging the 1985 birth switch and outlining steps to amend legal documents. A small fund was established for affected families. The deed to the Craftsman house was returned to my name, with a provision allowing Lucas and Sophia a 6-month occupancy lease if they wished to stay, after which they would need to vacate. That afternoon, I returned to the house for the first time in 2 months. The porch light was off, the windows dark. I inserted the key into the front door and stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, dust motes dancing in the air. The rooms felt different, empty of expectations, full of possibility. I walked through the living room, paused by the fireplace I'd restored. My fingers traced the carved wood. This home had once been my sanctuary and my prison. Now it was a blank page. I decided to host an open house. I contacted a local women's shelter to offer the property as transitional housing if I no longer wanted to keep it. In the meantime, I would rent a modest suite in Seattle with Margot, combining our lives in a home we chose together. 2 weeks later, Lucas and Sophia arrived for a meeting in the sunlit dining room. Their eyes were red, Lucas's filled with remorse, Sophia's with regret. We sat at the table where years before I'd handed her the keys. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered, voice delicate. "I never understood how much this home meant." I nodded. "I hope you learn what it means to be seen and respected." Lucas took my hand. "I've missed you, Mom. I want you back in my life." I smiled, warmth spreading through me. "I'd like that, Lucas. But things will be different." He nodded, tears falling. "I understand." Over the next month, we negotiated the occupancy lease. Lucas found a small apartment downtown. Sophia moved to a studio apartment near her art studio. Our goodbyes were quiet. No slamming doors, only hugs and apologies. Margot and I moved into our shared townhouse in Ballard. Bright windows, reclaimed wood floors, and a small garden where we planted lavender and rosemary. We filled our bookshelves with favorite novels, and Aunt Madeline's framed letter hung above my writing desk. That autumn, I finished drafting my memoir, a testament to resilience, truth, and the power of reclamation. I sent it to my publisher with a note. "This is not just my story. It's the story of every woman whose voice was silenced and reclaimed." The book launch took place in the bookstore where Margot worked, now co-managed by her and me. The sign above the doorway still read the next chapter. Friends, family, and distant cousins gathered beneath it, sipping tea and applauding as I read an excerpt. I looked into the audience. Margot at my side, Lucas in the front row, Aunt Madeline's framed photograph on display, and others who had found their own truths. My voice was steady as I recited the closing lines. "I left a house to find my home, a name to find myself, a sister to find belonging, and in the end I discovered that the greatest keys aren't brass. They're carried within us, in silence and in truth." Applause filled the room. I breathed in that moment, my new foundation. As the crowd dispersed and Margot hugged me, I realized the journey had transformed me. I was no longer the caretaker unseen, but the keeper of my own story. The final notes of my life were no longer dictated by others. They were mine, shaped by every step I dared to take. Months have passed since that crisp morning at Sickles General. Yet the echoes of Helen and Margot's shared journey still resonate in every corner of their new home. The townhouse in Ballard hums with quiet purpose. An engraved brass key hangs on the wall beside the door, symbolizing both endings and beginnings, and Aunt Madeline's framed letter glows softly above the writing desk. The bookstore, the next chapter, thrives under their joint stewardship, its shelves now adorned with their memoir, local art, and a curated selection of works celebrating resilience. Helen rises each day before dawn, the Seattle skyline unfolding through soft morning light. She pours herself a cup of coffee as Margot prepares tea, their routines interwoven yet distinct. They share the living room with the golden retriever Winston, once Helen's faithful companion, now a beloved member of both families. And in the evenings, they host informal gatherings, readings, community talks, and writing workshops for women rebuilding their own stories. Lucas has moved into a modest loft downtown, his relationship with Helen renewed by honesty and compassion. Sophia's art studio overlooks Elliott Bay. Her work now explores themes of identity and transformation, inspired by the events that once tore their family apart. Though the house in Cedar Grove is listed for transitional housing, Helen visits on weekends, tending the lavender and rosemary in the garden, plants that symbolize calm and remembrance. Margot, too, embraces this blended life. She mentors aspiring architects through community programs and continues her research at the university. On weekends, she and Helen drive south to Portland to visit their Carter cousins, sharing photographs and laughter that fill the gaps left by decades of silence. At night, they sit by the window beneath the sign, "The Next Chapter," reflecting in companionable silence. Helen often reaches across to squeeze Margot's hand, a gesture of gratitude for the sister whose existence once lay hidden in hospital archives. Margot, in turn, folds Helen into understanding arms, the refuge both women craved. Their story is no longer defined by a mistake made in an anonymous nursery. Instead, it speaks to the power of truth and the courage to reclaim one's name, home, and heart. In the end, the greatest keys they ever held were not brass, but the bonds of love and sisterhood, a life reclaimed, written by their own hands, one page at a time.